Everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Chen Yue. Today I want to talk about e-print, which is one of the writing systems used by non-ethnic minority in China. In this presentation, I will begin with the broader visual diversity of e-print across regions and then gradually narrow the discussion to program of iPrint in contemporary digital context. I would like to begin with a very simple visual observation. If we look at it spread across different regions, we immediately see strong visual diversity. Here, all three examples make snake, but the form are clearly different. So even before we ask linguistic questions, we are already facing a visual one. When we say it spreads, are we really thinking about one writing system? With small variations or something much more complex. For me, this diversity is not only visually interesting, it also raises a broader question. What kind of highly variable writing tradition be understood? How should we understand a writing tradition whose form appear across different regions, different habits, different histories, rather than within one unified system? To understand this situation, I'd like to begin with the linguistic and geographic background. China has 56 officially recognized ethnic groups, and the Yi are one of them. They are mainly distributed in southwest China, as you can see here in the blue circle. If we look more closely, Yi is used across 4 provinces and regions: Yunnan, Sichuan, Guizhou, and Guangxi. The Yi language belongs to the Tibetan Burman family, and it includes 6 major dialect groups. As shown here, the different colors represent different dialect areas. So, Yi writing develops across different regions and different spoken environments. Rather than within one single linguistic century, at the same time, many scholars suggest that this script was not always as divided as it looks today. Earlier stages are often understood as having had a stronger degree of unity, before later regional divergency become more pronounced. So the present situation is better understood as the divergency over time. This brings us to a question of why variations become so extensive. Here, I summarize the main reasons under 3 cases: BIMO authority, manuscript transformation, and acceleration. First, I will just briefly explain the role of BIMO here. The BIMO is a priest in the traditional religion of Yi people, as well as an important transmitter of Yi culture and leader of racial practices. The role is often passed down in families. As you can see here, the BIMO is holding a manuscript. Those manuscripts are the basis for recitation and visuals, and they are written in script. So the transmission of e-writing was closely tied to local culture authority and local liturgies. Second, e-texts were transmitted mainly through manuscript culture. Most surviving materials are handwritten rather than printed, so forms were copied again and again through long chains of transmission. This allowed local differences to remain visible over time. So manuscript transmission did not preserve the script. It also helped to produce the variation. Third, many communities were relatively isolated from one another in the past. As this image shows here, many e-communities traditionally lived in a mountainous area, which made contact between regions more difficult. Because of this, circulation was often limited, and local writing traditions could continue independently for a long period of time. That is why variation was shaped not only by language, but also by geography and local social conditions. Taken together, those 3 factors help explain why why variation becomes so extensive. The result of this hierarchical process is extensive variation. Here, for example, all of those different forms refer to the same meaning statement. So this is not just a minor visual differences. It creates a very complex situation. The related forms are difficult to identify, compare, and organize. In other words, the system becomes very rich, but it's also very difficult to unify. Those differences should not be seen simply as random inconsistency or graphic noise. Instead, they can be understood as the visible result of repeated local decisions in how writing was copied, syndicated, preserved, and transmitted. People in different places made their own choice, and those differences gradually become more visible. And once variation reaches this scale, standardization becomes historically understandable. Oh, sorry. Yeah. After line 49, the Chinese government introduced language and script policies for ethnic minorities. However, standardization did not follow one single path. From here onward, what we see is not one common solution, but several regional responses to the same problem. In Sichuan, the standardization of its script was influenced by the development of Hanyu Pinyin, the Latin-based phonemic system for Chinese. In this context, in 1958, Sichuan proposed a draft known as the Liangsan Yiping script scheme. As the image shows, this scheme completely changed the original appearance of its script by taking the Liangsan alphabet as the visual basis of the letter forms. So this was an earlier attempt at standardization, as might be expected. However, the proposal was not finally adopted. After that, a new scheme was developed using more than 8,000 characters dedicated from the traditional script used in Sichuan. It first became a provincial standard, then a national standard, and later entered the international character encoding standard. This was a major achievement. But the success of one standard did not mean that it could automatically serve as a shared solution for all e-writing traditions. Yunnan and Guizhou continued to develop their own material and the reference system. So standardization did not lead to one universally accepted endpoint. Instead, multi-directions continued to exist. But if the Sichuan standard becomes so well established, why the other regions not simply adopt it as the common solution? There are many reasons, political, administrative, but here I want to highlight other two main ones. First, the Sichuan reform was strongly shaped by phonetic reform. Although the Sichuan standard syndicated forms from the older writing tradition, it also changed the nature of this script, moving it from historically ideographic tradition to the standard. Second, it also involved a different writing orientation. The two pictures were taken by me during field work in Liangsan, Sichuan in 2023. While speaking with local Bimo, the first show how they write the script, and the second show how they read it. From writing to reading, the text is rotated 90 degrees. So why does this happen? After writing, during visual recitation, the Bimo needs to hand the manuscript. Sorry, I don't have an actual manuscript here, so I use this paper as a simple example. At the side of the manuscript, there are usually a wooden stick. If we imagine this one is a wooden stick, take them together, and it forms the manuscript. When writing, the beam always writes from top to bottom, and then left to right. But when the beam reads during the visuals, the manuscript is high using this wooden stick, so it's like this. So the text is rotated by 90 degrees like this. This point becomes clearly here. On the left, we see the traditional writing direction from top to bottom and from left to right. But when the manuscript is rotated, the reading direction changes and produces the form shown on the right. The Sichuan standard adopted this rotated form as the basis for standardization. So the issue was not only layout, it also involved a reorientation of grade 4 and the writing order. That is also one reason why the Sichuan model could not simply be adopted everywhere else. But even so, many scholars and native speakers still hope that the script could be unified in some way. Because of this, the East Script collaboration group was established. They proposed a shared system across regions. Their main idea was to keep grade form and mid stable while allowing different dialect groups to read the character in their own way. This led to important cross-regional reference works. Another group of scholars asked a different question. If Sichuan had already entered the international standard, why not use that as the basis for the common system? From this idea came another proposal, the common standard in script characteristics. So by this point, the situation was still quite complicated. Different schemes exist, but none of them became a widely used solution across all regions. For my research, however, the main focus is not on those proposed solutions, but on ideography. Before turning to that, I need to clarify how I use two terms in this talk. One is Slavic as they remain to the model standardization system they presented by Sichuan standard in script. One is ideography as they remain to the traditional character materials used in Yunnan, Guizhou, and Guangxi. Those are functional definitions for this research, not absolute classifications. I should also say that I have worked in practice with the syllabic system. This is one of my earlier type design projects for syllabic. It's a multiple script family including Hanzi, Yi, Latin, and Arabic. It was also my first type design project, and it was designed mainly for short text use. This is another type design project I made for syllabic. Compared with the previous one, this typeface is more modern toward display use. It also includes multiple scripts, including Hanzi, Yi, and Latin. Through those design experiments with syllabic Yi, however, I gradually felt a strong limitation in design process. One important reason is that syllabic Yi does not always support a very natural or fluent writing rhythm in typographic practice. As we discovered earlier, this script was not original used in the upright form in which it appears today. So my attention gradually shifted to ideography, but when I turned into the ideography, I found that the problem was even more fundamental. Ideography is still not encoded. That means it has no standard code ports, and it remains mainly image-based rather than text-based. As a result, inputs, research, search, and storage are still limited. So before encoding can be properly proposed, the script first needs to be organized as data. The ideography Unicode submission working group is working on this problem by organizing character data for sources. I'm part of this work, and this is still ongoing. This is an overview of the working group's workflow, from source collection to the construction of the master glyph database. The main idea is simple. The project moves from separate documentary material towards a more structured comparative system. I will now go through the main steps. We begin with published source materials. Those are the main sources we used in the project, and they are both authoritative and historically important. To make later processing easier, each source is given a short abbreviation such as U0, U1, B0, and Q0. This helps keep the workflow clear when the materials becomes larger and more complex. To make the data easier to manage, the first practical step is to turn the headwords in the document into manageable digital units. So we begin with scanning and segmentation. As we can see here, we first scan the source documents and then segment the headwords into individual glyph images, like here. Each headword is then exported as a separate image file. So at this stage, we get a first source-based image set. But image files alone are not enough for later comparison and management. So we began to organize them through font files, which made the glyph much easier to handle systematically. The next step then was to turn them into vector glyphs and connect them to structured data. Here, we use font creator to trace the glyphs and turn images into vector outlines. At this point, the scanned characters are no longer just images. They become vector glyphs that can be handled more systematically. Then we put the glyphs into font file and give them temporary code points. Those temporary code points are not only internal labels for this research. They help us to manage sort and trace the glyphs consistently. Once the glyphs are in font file, they can be linked more easily to source information and structured annotation. So this is a point where visual form and source data begin to work together. The next step is to organize them in a more systematic way. For each source, a separate worksheet was created. All of them use the same basic structure with 10 fields for each glyph entry. Those include temporary code points, glyph, source reference, radical, stroke count, pronunciation, and meaning. In the end, the user worksheet contains 4,109 rows. U1 has 2,604. D0 has 2,579 and Q0 has 2,599. This keeps the data clear, source-based, and traceable at the earlier stage. Once the source-based tables are ready, we can build the master table. The purpose here is to bring the different sources into one comparative structure. This figure shows an example of the master table. It includes 15 fields, covering things like radical, stroke count, formed from each source reference, meanings, and notes. The important point is not just that the table stores data. The important point is that it places different sources, traditions side by side, in one comparative structure. In this comparison process, some forms show high structure consistency, while others show significant structure differences. So the problem is not simply to connect forms. The real problem is to decide how different forms are related. If the forms are highly similar in structure, then we move to the next step, which is semantic checking. If both structure and meaning match, the forms are placed in the same row of the master table. If the meaning does not match, then a new row is needed. If there are major structural differences, we need to judge whether they should be treated as graphic variants or structural variants. graphic variants differ only slightly. They still share close pronunciation, meaning, and structural inheritance. So they can be treated as one character. Structural variants differ much more strongly in form. Even when pronunciation and meaning are close, they should be treated as different characters. This is an example of graphic variants. The fixed form from U0, U1, and D0 show only minor visual differences. This is they all represent the theme, or they are treated as orthographic variants and grouped under a single entry. As you can see in those 3,934, here, let's see, next slide. Yep. 3 graphic variants are grouped into the same row. This is an example of structural variant. Here, the form for skin or shape from U0, Q0, and D0 differ much more strongly in structure. Even though the meaning is the same, they are treated as heterographic forms and placed in separate rows. As we can see here, the structural variants highlighted in light gray are placed in different rows. I think it's not clear here yet, but yes, I think it should be like this part. After this stage of comparison and integration, we now have a core source master table. This work is still ongoing. So far, we have built a core source master table with about 6,900 entries. The value of this work is not that it immediately completes standardization, but that it builds a comparable, traceable, and extensible framework and provides important support for the future encoding of ethnography. And for my research, it has already provided a very important foundation. And from it, I also dedicate a core character set for the next stage. In the next stage, I will continue with more typographic research on ethnographic key in structure and stylistic and later typeface development. But yeah, that's the next stage. And I would be very happy to share that work in the future as well if possible. Yeah, so that's all. Thank you.